Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi, this episode is about doing good work. Employees doing good work at your company. How are they performing? Are their work results good? And are they set up to do good work? There are many dimensions. Do they have good work to do? What type of work is each person tasked with? Is there good work alignment? What is the fit and fairness? How healthy are their work environments and experiences? How well are employees being managed? Is your company giving employees good work? As we update our work approaches and practices, designing new work experiences that improve productivity long-term depends on fostering and supporting healthier and happier working lives. Research shows that when we have good work, we do good work. We easily contribute effort and energy, feeding a self-reinforcing positive cycle of growth and well-being. Alternatively, when there is low morale, people are managed poorly and skills are unaligned, there are often many unaddressed emotional, mental, and physical health issues. And we are familiar with scenarios of unmotivated, disconnected workers and poor performance. How does good work stimulate and support good results and employee well-being? What does good work look like? I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Zofia Bajorek, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Employment Studies in the UK. Zofia was HR Magazine's most influential thinker in 2022 and 2023. She has recently been focusing on the quality of work to improve workforce health and well-being. Hi, Zofia. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I am very well. It's great to see you again. It was lovely meeting you in Athens recently. You started off studying psychology.
I did, yeah. It's something, it was a subject that really piqued my interest at A-level. Our school had only just started offering psychology as an A-level. It was something that you hadn't done at all between GCSE, and I just thought actually it was something that just really interested me. It's a completely new topic, a completely new sphere. And when you dug into it, it wasn't just about, that stereotype of, I'm going to be able to read your mind. No, which everybody says, I'm a psychologist. Can you guess what I'm thinking? No, that isn't psychology. Psychology goes way deeper like that, about behaviour change, about why we do things, how we do things, how we think, and how all that can have an impact on the decisions that we made and the way we live our lives. And for me, that was something that was really fascinating, really interesting, and completely away from, I suppose, other technical subjects that actually can get you really bogged down in really depressing life. I wanted something that was going to be completely different and something I could get my teeth into and enjoy. And it's actually something that I found I was good at. So I stuck with it.
And it's become your life. Then you do more psychology. You do a master's, which is focused on why individuals undertake temporary employment. And I'm very interested in the blended workforce, which in the US can be gig work or 1099 work, people who are independent contractors, as well as people who are doing multiple Handy or Uber, multiple engagements. What was that project about, and what were the conclusions that came out of that?
I suppose when you do a master's in the UK, and I suppose everywhere, part of your master's outcome is a in-depth research project on a field that's related to what you're studying. So I was doing occupational psychology at the time, and one of the modules that we had looked at had been the future of work and occupational stress and health at work. And the two blended things that came out of those two modules were like the way that we are working is changing, and that could have an impact on our health. And so the way in which the work was changing at that point was there was a rise in temporary employment. And before I had done my own master's.
And just to put it in context, that was in 2005, 2006.
Yeah, nearly 20 years ago now, which seems crazy. So I had been a temporary worker myself, and I had a specific focus on my temporary work. So I was doing it literally to earn some money because I was going to be spending 4 months in Africa, and I needed to raise my plane fare, my accommodation costs when I was out there, for my jabs and everything like that. And I was a poor student at that time, so I needed to raise money. So I temped literally to raise money. But what we were hearing about, what we were seeing about in our course, was there are a variety of reasons why people undertake temporary work. Some of it is voluntary. Some of it, like me, is because they want to earn money, or they want to have a more flexible lifestyle, or they want to have a pick and choose about what career might be interesting to them. So it's almost like a job preview. For others, temporary work is less involuntary. It just might be the only contract that is available to them at that particular point of time.
Skills based.
Yeah, exactly. Or in the sector that they're going into, it might be just how that sector contracts. And so therefore, I suppose your agency and your autonomy over the type of contract you choose and how you choose it could have an impact on the health, on your health, and how you find working as a temporary worker. And I suppose how you explore the world of temporary employment. So I said, I did it in my job for 6 to 7 months. But during that time, I was almost treated like a permanent member of staff because I enjoyed my job. I threw myself into it. I made friends with colleagues there. And, I saw it as when I come out of my master's, this is somewhere where I could potentially work again. But for other people, like I said, for those who are involuntary and having to do it because it's the nature of their role, it may become more transactional. And so they might not have that opportunity to develop workplace relationships, to have voice or have progression or more choice over the type of work that they do. And obviously, all those things have an impact on your health and well-being.
Sure. And that leads beautifully into what you then did for a PhD, which was about the management of temporary staff in healthcare emergency departments and the implications for patient safety and service quality. Thinking about those situations, do you have the same range of circumstances where people are both voluntary and involuntary? And therefore, for those people who are involuntarily in those situations, is that the key factor that changes how much they engage in their work and the quality of their work? I mean, it's not their fault.
No, totally. Right. The NHS, as anybody knows, is a really, really messy organisation. It's huge, it's massive, and chronically understaffed. So in many ways, although the NHS don't want to use temporary staff in many ways because they're more expensive, and you might not get continuity of care from staff because you're having different teams, you're blended teams all the time. They're a necessity because of patient to staff ratios, making sure that patient care can be delivered. They're going to be a necessity. So once again, what we see when we come into the NHS is that there are so many different forms of temporary staff. And when I say that, I could mean you could be a permanent member of a team, say you work in accident and emergency, but for a day temporarily, you might be involved in a case in intensive care or geriatric. And so temporarily, you're being moved into a different team. So in that way, you could be seen as a temp in a different team.
Okay. You are a full-time worker.
You are a full-time worker, but you're being temporarily moved from your full-time position into another place.
Right. But that could also be really interesting and exciting to have new responsibilities.
100%. But every department has its own challenges, ways of working, ways of communication, right? So we even see that in massive organisations that are less safety critical.
Yes, very true, very true.
Then in the NHS, you get what are called bank staff. So these are permanent staff who apply to their hospital's bank so that if a placement comes up where more staff is needed, then they just use the staff in the same hospital but deposit them into a different place, or even in the same place but on a different shift. And a lot of people do that for purely financial reasons. It means that they are able to have a little bit more money at the end of the month.
Right.
And then you have agency staff, which come from external agencies. Now, you can still have a permanent member of a hospital staff who goes to an agency also to pick up extra shifts, or you can have people who literally just want to do agency work. And for those, that is a lot about their flexibility in when and where and how they work, but also it's financial. And the NHS are trying to reduce the number of agency workers because it is more expensive to use them. And although the data doesn't really say it's less safe, and I have to really caveat that, what the concerns are is, and what my PhD found, is that because they are external members of staff coming into an internal team, they need and require more management, which in a completely busy accident and emergency situation where there are already staff shortages, they might not get that management that they need to be fully integrated into a team. And that's where an incident could happen.
You did some research on the side for legal services. I'm interested in that because you were looking from a systems approach. You're studying the delays in the magistrate's court. The systems approach to labor is complicated. That is something that is important in terms of how we think about work these days, because it is so interrelated and interdependent, and all these elements are changing. What were some of the highlights and even surprises that you found during that work?
Well, so that was a really interesting piece of work, and we were looking at an intervention that magistrates' courts were trying to develop at that time called Speedy summary justice. And so the aim was for cases that could be easily tried in magistrates' court and be dealt with really quickly, that it was a one-stop shop. They will go in, they will have their trial, they will be cleared, or they'll be charged with something and they'll be out.
Okay.
What we found was
not so much.
That's the utopia, right? That's what we want. We want clear, speedy summary justice where everybody feels like a fair trial has happened, that we're not having delays in the system, that it's not costing the system much more. We're not having these, we're not.
I can hear the but.
Yeah. But as with many systems and parts, they don't always talk to each other. So the prosecution might not have all the evidence that they need for their case. The defence might not have talked closely enough with the prosecution to make sure that all the evidence is being shared. So both parties are coming to the court with the same information. Then we might have probation here on the side, which might be needed in case of for the charging and the case, and what help probation can support. That's 3.
Okay.
And then you're, I suppose, hoping that the defendant's going to show up in court. So that's the other missing link. And so for simple, speedy summary justice to happen, you need all those parts talking to each other. And once again, in big systems, it isn't as easy to do that, because once again, it's another system that's overworked, underpaid, understaffed, and it's messy, and organisations are messy, and humans are messy. And I think this is what we find when we talk about real life work, right?
Yes.
And evaluating real life interventions, in that you might have all this theory about how wonderful this could be, but when you're looking at the practical intricacies of how organisations and people work, you see that the two really don't combine as neatly as we hope that it should.
So now shifting from public systems, from healthcare and the legal system, you started working at the Work Foundation and looking a lot at workplace policy and management practices. You shifted to focus on and emphasize the effect on the health of employees of how they were working. And also part of that was to do with the aging workforce. What was setting some of the foundational layers for you and building blocks of the challenges of work as it has been evolving, because since the very start of your academic career, so much has been changing in the workplace, in the nature of work. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that and what you've been observing and finding with your research.
I think the way that the work is evolving, we've understood and we've got more evidence now showing that if we don't look after people's health and well-being in the workplace, and it can have an impact on both retention and their productivity levels. And so it's really key for organisations to think about that. The wealth of evidence now, I think if you're not an organisation who is listening to that message, you're going to suffer. Right. Unfortunately for me, and in my 10, 15 years of working in workplace well-being and health and well-being at work, there's actually been really little change in organisational practice and what organisations are doing and or are thinking about doing when it comes to looking at health and well-being at work. So, for example, one of my first things I had to do when at the Work Foundation was a systematic review for NICE, looking at the evidence about
what's NICE?
The National Institute for Care and Health Excellence, I think. Okay. It has just recently changed, but it's essentially a body that looks at and asks for evidence views about how we can change and how we can make things better. And one of the first things I had to do is I was in a big team looking at, which was actually involved the Institute for Employment Studies. So it's a very, very small world because that's now where I currently work. Yeah. Looking at the evidence of what interventions help workplace wellbeing practices. Right. And we did loads of, as a systematic review, you're pulling through piles and piles and piles and piles and piles and piles of papers.
And lots of the interventions were not helpful.
Lots of interventions aren't helpful or there's not much evidence for them. But what we see time and time again is the evidence of good management and good employment relationships. And, as I spoke about the conference in Athens, that's where we're still struggling because that's not seen as an exciting intervention for workplaces to look at when it comes to health and well-being at work. It's not the sexy approach that they want to take, and it's harder for them to look at.
I read some articles about this. It was very interesting because it was giving people specific interventions for specific issues and conditions was far less effective than the systematic approach to changing how work was done and how people were managed.
Totally.
Got it. Okay. Great to know that you were behind that research. Love it. Okay.
We discussed it briefly pre this, but it goes back to some of the really seminal documents in this health and well-being and mental health and good work sphere. So in 2006, there were two researchers, Graham Waddell and Kim Burton, who looked at this question, who their paper was looking at, is work good for your health or not? Okay. And so they also did a massive systematic review and review of the evidence, both academic evidence and grey research, as we like to call it in our world. And they found, and they concluded essentially that all being well, work is good for your health. But they caveat, and it's a strong caveat, that it has to be good quality work. And that is where we're still struggling, because people don't really know what good quality work is. And once again, it's not like your really exciting employee benefit that you want to be able to bring in to say, this is what we're doing to help you. Here's your head massage, because that's really going to help your boss putting excessive amount of stress on you. Right. So it's touching the hard stuff that organisations don't want to touch.
So what is good quality work? What is good work? Because that's what you were speaking about at the conference. And there's a really interesting good work framework that is being captured by the World Economic Forum. But as you've explained, it was something that actually started back in 2006 in the UK. How would you define good work?
I suppose for me, good work is a combination of things. There's not one thing that makes work good. There's plenty of different elements that I we have a good work model.
Okay.
And I think it includes things like being given varied and interesting work. So it's not just about having work, it's about the type of work that you are given. Specifically work that matches your interests. That means that your skills are being used, because there's a lot of well-being evidence there saying if you're not using your skills, you're being undervalued, you're being underemployed.
And you feel that.
So it's making sure that your skills that you have are being used, and you're given work that challenges you but also excites you. So that's one aspect of good work. The next is something that probably wouldn't surprise you, but it's about having a bit of autonomy, control, ownership. Right. So it goes back to that Karasek demand control model. Yep. How much control do I have over the work that I do versus the demands that are put on me? And therefore, how much autonomy do I have in the workplace about what I choose to do? So it goes a little bit back to that varied work and interesting work. Then you've got working in a fair workplace.
Okay.
So all that research about distributional and interactional justice, and justice in the workplace. So am I being rewarded fairly for the work that I'm doing? Am I being treated fairly? Yep. Am I being seen as similar to other members of staff? So this issue about fairness and that's not just fairness in terms of monetary pay, because actually the research shows that actually good work isn't really about money. And how much you're paid for doing the work. There's an element of fairness in our bonuses distributed fairly, but it's not so much as salary. Yep. It's about if there's a bonus, is that done fairly? But it's just being, are things communicated to everybody at the same time? Is there fairness in what's being communicated? Is there fairness in the way that policies and practices are being implemented? So working in a fair workplace and being felt that you're being valued in that workplace. Then there's effort reward balance. That's what I mentioned a little bit then about the Karasek demand and control. Do we have enough say in what we're doing versus what's being given to us? Then an interesting one that's not really thought about very much as part of good work, but I think is really important. It's about the level of professional learning and development that you get on your job. So you're not staying stagnant, because that's a real danger.
Particularly now.
Yeah, exactly. So you want to feel like in your workplace, you're not stagnant, that you're given the opportunity to develop, to learn, to be promoted. It's that continual skill development. Then there's employee voice. So do I have a chance to speak about what's bothering me at work? Are we communicated with? Are we working in an environment that's now based on co-collaboration? Are our voices important, or are we just told what we're doing and we're automations, which we're not. We're not robots, we're people. We want to be consulted in what we're doing. And then there's strong working relationships. And this is for me where some of the management comes in. It's not just about how you're managed or when you're managed. There's also a lot of peer responses. And, I think the peer relationship is something that's very undermined in the workplace and might be even more undermined now a little bit when we're talking about hybrid work, where we might not connect with our peers as much as we used to. I'm not saying that that's a negative of hybrid work. As you know, it's all about how those relationships are managed and implemented. Exactly, it's not a negative. It's like my thoughts on this. But having that good, strong relationship where even if a hybrid situation comes in, that you know that you're still going to be supported by your management and your peers is really important. And then finally, and it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, is secure work and secure employment, and about how you feel your contract is being honoured, whether it's a two-way contract or whether a contract's being imposed. Is it transactional? Have you got social relationship contracts? Right. So your element of security that you have in your workplace and in the nature of the work that you're doing. So good work isn't just one thing. It's, it's kind of like nice and cute to say, let's think about good work. But actually, if you look at all the elements that are that make up good work. It's difficult. So this is why I'm saying it's not easy for organisations to think about this. It's just probably why they don't want to touch it with a barge pole. But all the evidence now suggests that if you want a healthy workplace, if you want a workplace that's engaged, that's going to be retained, that you're going to be able to keep, that you're going to be able to encourage, and are going to be healthy and productive, this is what you've got to be focusing on.
Before we started recording, we were talking about the different types of work arrangements. How important is the security of that work arrangement? Younger people are choosing some portfolio careers at some points. Other points, they might have a full-time job. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily feel less secure because they are potentially choosing to have multiple clients because that actually presents more security to them. So I'm interested how you have seen the evolution of how we're working, what the different choices are that people are making as the workplace is evolving, and how good work shows up, because it isn't a good job anymore. It really is good work, and how people are picking and choosing how that configuration works for them.
For me, the really important word in all of that was choice. And somebody's choice about the work that they have and the work that they can do, because some people don't have that choice, and that's where the negative mental health and the negative implications of the job happen. So if we're thinking about like the gig worker, right? They don't have that two-way flexibility. It's normally, I need you to work here and now. And if you don't, then you don't get paid. And so it's harder for them to have that flexibility. Now, in the UK at the moment, you know, as everybody knows, we're a little bit politically unstable. We're heading up for a general election, but it hasn't been announced yet. But one of the I suppose key actions from the Labour government is to not have the gig economy, to stop 0-hour contracts, which for a lot of people is actually going to be a really negative thing.
Yeah, sure.
Although 0-hour contracts can be bad for some, that's only when they're managed badly. And once again, it just goes back to this two-way flexibility and communication and good work, right? So if they don't have that two-way flexibility in how 0-hour contracts are working, it can be bad. But for when they are good and when they have been applied well, and when there's communications between both sides, actually the well-being of 0-hour contract staff is really, really good, because they're happy with that contract negotiation that they've got, and that flexibility and the income that they're having. So it's not necessarily about the type of contract, it's how it's done and whether it's done in a good way. Now, for people who are freelancers, you know, you can see why or self-employed, you can see why their job satisfaction might be really good, because they're doing what they want to do. Normally, if they're in a sector where there's a lot of work available for them, they have the choice. They have the choice of what clients they're going to do. They have the choice of doing that varied, interesting work, having that autonomy about what they do and the way in which they do it. Sometimes the time frames in which they're asked to do the work might be constrained by clients, but they can choose not to do that piece of work.
Sure.
So it, once again, good work still fits into all of those different styles of contract, because of what elements of good work are. And you can still have good, strong working relationships between clients and people and your working networks when you're a freelancer, when you're self-employed, and even when you're on a 0-hour contract. It's not impossible, but once again, it goes back down to how these are being managed, and if they're managed correctly, and if they're valuing you as an individual. And I think that's something that isn't talked about as much. I know you've done some great work in empathy and how we need to be more empathetic to each other, and I think part of that is understanding what encourages us to work how we do, and what our values are, and what we bring to a workplace. And if a workplace or an employer engages with you on that level and has some understanding about why you need to be have a 0-hour contract, or why you need to be freelancer, or why you've chosen a specific job, then that helps both sides really importantly.
The Good Work Agenda came out in 2006. There has been so much change, as we've mentioned, in how work is done, the nature of work, who's doing it, in what configurations. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and that accelerated some trends, changed also people's expectations, and people had a lot of reflections about how they wanted to live their lives, and that changed things. Where are we now in terms of good work? You said we haven't moved that far. Do you see some pockets, some sectors, a percentage of companies, obviously in the UK specifically, who are moving in that direction? In the private sector, I assume. And there is this key topic of mental health, which you have brought up, very much related to good work and the well-being that it creates. What do we have to do? Not just like to do and improve productivity, but what do we have to do in order to enable good work to mitigate some of the mental health issues?
So I think the pandemic was an interesting one for many reasons, right? It threw everything up in the air. I don't think, line managers, CEOs, CMOs, chief medical officers, whatever, I don't think they had a manual about, how do we manage everything through a worldwide pandemic that we didn't foresee. Yeah. But what it highlighted to a lot of our research and a lot of researchers in this areas is that organizations that really think about and have embedded the importance of things like well-being at work and actually understand the underlying factors of good work are those that actually mastered the transitions from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic more easily, because there was already an understanding of what is good for my employees, how are we going to do this, and how are we going to do this successfully.
That's so interesting. What did you see? I didn't know that there was research on that.
So it's things like, that transition between working for being office to working from home, right? So people that had good management practices already in place, who understood the implication of making sure that communication was consistent with employees, to understand that it's actually really important to check in, to do the hello, how are you doing, but also listen to what people were saying, and to have had a workplace policy about, looking after hybrid working, or ensuring that people who might have been suffering for many reasons during the COVID pandemic, if they had a workplace health and wellbeing policy in place already, they had places to signpost. They had workplace adjustments to put in place. It wasn't something that they had to think about. It was already there before people hit crisis point.
Sure.
And this is the thing about mental health at work, right? We all have mental health.
Right.
Every human has mental health. Every human has fluctuating mental health. But what's important for the workplace is that work doesn't make it worse.
Right.
And COVID could have made mental health worse for so many reasons, not just because people were anxious about catching COVID and the implications it could have for their health, but we were socially isolated. We weren't allowed to talk or go out, to see people. Right. Some people were living in...
And it was particularly harsh in the UK sometimes.
Yeah, some people were living in houses where they were on their own. And then especially for a lot of younger employees, their bedroom became their office. And so there was no disconnect between life and work. And so for many reasons, COVID had massive health and wellbeing implications. But organisations that had things like how managers should be able to have conversations about how this could be affecting people's work, who were understanding about job crafting a little bit. So some people's role might not have been easy to replicate in a home office environment. So how can we make sure that people were still engaged in the work they were doing and crafting roles so that they could still do it at home? If somebody did have a health condition, how are they supported at work? And it goes back to what I said in the presentation, that for a lot of organisations, you want to catch people before they reach crisis point. So
Sure.
you don't want to be pulling people out of a fast flowing river and then trying to fix them up. You want to go up that stream to have a look at what's pushing them in the first place. And if you have an understanding of the concerns, the queries, the questions, the stresses that people might be feeling at work, as a manager and as an organisation and as HR body, you therefore have the responsibility to do something about it. What I've been saying is that organisations might not be collecting that data, or they might not be collecting that data systematically. And so if we want good health, we need to have good work. But to understand both good work and good health, we need to have good evidence. And all organisations are going to be different. So what you implement in organisation A will be different to how it's done in organisation B. So you need to look at your own organisational data, look at the HR analytics. What are your causes of sickness absence? Are there specific pockets of sickness absence in organisations? Are there pockets of sickness absence under one manager? You know, and it's things like this. What we do know, like I said, is actually if you focus on good work, then that's really important. But how good work is implemented in each organisations will be different depending on what the problem is in the first place. And if you don't understand what the problem is, you're not going to help going down that line.
And what is some of the key problems now as we've come out of the pandemic and there's been a lot of turmoil and tension about how and where we're working? It's settling down now. Obviously, it's been slightly different in England in terms of there's been more flexibility prior to the pandemic, or more legally permitted flexibility. And there's also been the challenge of a recession that has changed the dynamics, which we haven't had here. Often managers and leaders don't focus as much on the health and well-being of their employees when they're trying to survive and get through a recession. How have you seen, in terms of the research that you're doing now, how people are making changes, where they're focusing, where some of the biggest problems are, or in all of those different elements, which are the ones that people can change the most easily, I guess?
Right. So I would say there's quite a few challenges facing the UK workforce at the moment. At the moment, which is really weird for the UK, because we're not like a lot of our European counterparts who like to go on strike. But actually, we are experiencing a lot of industrial action at the moment, especially like in education and the NHS.
Right.
And what's causing that? Because people are now overworked and underpaid. People aren't experiencing that good work model that, we've spent half an hour talking about. They feel like they don't have autonomy in how they're working, that they're not being fairly rewarded. And they're tired. And they're stressed, and they're hitting that being pulled out the river burnout point, which in a lot of industries isn't going to help. And that's causing a lot of retention issues, and it's causing a lot of recruitment and retention issues that organisations are floundering about at the moment, really. So that's one big thing that's facing organisations at the moment. Related to that is the cost of living crisis. So you've mentioned that we're in a recession. Energy bills have been catastrophically high in the UK. Food prices have been rising, but people's salaries haven't been rising at the same level. And so people are really feeling it. And so whenever we talk a lot about, health and well-being, but actually what's becoming more crucial for organisations to think about and talk about now is financial well-being. Right. So are we educating our employees about their finances, about the importance of pensions, and making sure that they have the means that they need to live. And in those areas that they're not, that's where a lot of industrial action is happening. And also you've talked about changing in the way of work, right? So yes, we have had flexible employment in the UK for a while. It's been glacial, I suppose, in how it's being implemented, and it's
hidden.
Hidden and not implemented consistently, even within organisations. So now, there's been a recent change in legislation about flexible working, and obviously the pandemic has really highlighted actually that people can work from home. And they can be just as productive, if not more productive, when they're working from home. And, you know, this has been an eye-opener for many organisations. It's also been one that's cast a lot of doubt. And for me, it's quite interesting, really, isn't it? Because it goes back to some of the psychological contracts about relationships at work. And actually, how are people trusting people to work from work?
Love that you bring that up.
Even if they are trusting people to work from home. You've got a lot of some organisations who have been putting tracking monitors on computers about how and when mice are being moved. And I think that's concerning. And one thing for me is we need to change our mindset. Organisers need to change their mindset a bit about what we class as productivity, right? Is it output per hour? Which, you know, I could say I've done a really long 9-hour day today, but, you know, I've been sat watching Netflix while I've been working. I don't, just a caveat for any of my employers, that
was an idea.
That was an idea. It was an example. It's a metaphor about productivity going on here. But, or are we looking at productivity with regards to the quality of output that people are producing? Because somebody could produce something in 5 hours that took somebody 9 hours to do, and the quality is just as good. So they've been just as productive, but in less time. So I think we need to start thinking about how we look at productivity. And unfortunately, a lot of these issues come down to the poor management level and the line manager about how all these things are discussed and managed at work. And one thing that we've seen in the UK consistently is that we have really bad management, and we don't
everywhere,
train
not just the
our
UK.
managers.
No.
We don't develop our managers. We don't have good management pipelines. And actually, if we want really healthy, important transitions, we don't know what the next thing to hit the workplace will be. You know, who knows? We might have climate change, and floods might systematically wipe out loads of things. But we want people who can systematically manage change and manage the transitions really well. That inevitably goes down to our line managers or managers at mid-management level who don't always have the skills and the people skills or the managerial skills that are needed to manage these transitions. And if the pandemic has highlighted anything to me, it's really the importance of good management. If you want good work and good health, you have to have good management.
What haven't I asked you that I should have done?
Oh, we didn't really talk about the aging aspect, did we?
That is interesting because Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, it's a huge investment fund. He's talking about how the retirement crisis that's going on now in the States, there are, I think it was 2.7 million more people retiring than were expected. I think there can be two issues here. One, they're fed up. I don't want to have to learn these new ways of doing things. There's AI, there's hybrid work. I don't want to have to be managing. And also we should have, I believe, a much more graceful phasing so that people don't have to go from 100% to zero. And if there were a stepping down, they could transition to not use the knowledge of a corporation and not have to step out so quickly with the more challenging work environment. So what was that study related to the aging population, and how does that relate to the situation? I imagine you have a lot of people retiring in the UK, but I don't know what the demographic structure is there.
Yeah, one thing that we've seen from the pandemic is actually a lot of older people leaving the workplace, and that's not necessarily to do with age. It's also related to having long-term health conditions, and then finding difficulties returning to work or coming back to work. I think with the demographic of the workforce, what we have found in our research is young people and the older workforce inherently want the same thing from the workplace, which is to be valued at work and to have their skills used. So you can have your baby boomers, your Gen Zs, your Gen Ys, Gen Xs. I don't even know what Gen I am because it all changes so much. But inherently, between all of that, everybody wants to be valued at work and to have their skills used. And once again, which is why that good work model is so fundamental, because if you look at that model, that can be applied across all generations and all scenarios. So if you're looking at somebody who's maybe wanting to start a phased transition into retirement, you can look at that and say, well, how will that impact the type of work that you do and the level of autonomy you want? And it can be thought about in a really simple way. There was a thing called unretirement a few years ago where people who had retired are now wanting to come back to work because they've actually seen how important work is. If we think about the amount of time we spend at work and our social engagements that we have through it, work is important to health. We invest a lot of time and energy and relational interactions with work. And so if you just stop work, you lose such of an element of an essence of who you are. So if organizations actually think about that, and also about the organizational knowledge and memory that they might have if somebody's going and they're not training or using that time for that knowledge exchange to happen, it's a massive loss to organizations. So a phased retirement can be really important to both the individual who is experiencing retirement, but also a really important time for knowledge exchange. And actually, it's going to be more important now organizations can retain old members of staff because we're not having enough babies. we haven't got the younger workforce coming through.
I know.
And so we are going to be at this crisis. What concerns me is that people are going to be working longer and living longer with long-term health conditions. Not one, not two, but maybe three.
Right.
So organisations, not only are they having to cope with an ageing workforce, but potentially a sicker workforce.
Oh gosh.
Or a workforce that might need more workplace adjustments or effective management of people at work so that they can stay at work if they want to for that longer time. And I think that's another important challenge that if organisations aren't even thinking about or considering, it's one that you're already losing time, and it's one that you're going to have to really get on the treadmill to look at because it's going to happen.
Effective management has to happen now. Otherwise, the well-being and mental health issues are going to compound and then be even greater for those people who need to be more effective managing those situations in the future.
Yeah.
Oof. Okay.
Importantly,
yes.
and then this is my last point. We've got to think about that poor manager as well, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what can be done about the managers? So as the last question to you, what can organizations do tomorrow, next week, to help those poor managers?
Right. Who would want to be a manager at this time? Like, that's why I put, when I'm at conferences, I ask, who wants to be a manager? Because what we're asking of you is nightmare. Why would you want to do it? So for me, we need to rethink what we want or call as good management. Okay. So for me, that looks at, are we promoting people or the right people into management roles?
Right.
Are we thinking about who we want and why we want them there? So is it based on somebody's desire or ability to manage, or because they've crawled up that greasy pole of management because they're so technically good at their role that they've hit management level? Or are we wanting managers who are empathetic, who are sympathetic, who have emotional intelligence, who have the people management skills that we want, but who are also technically good at their job? And do we start having? Do we need to rethink the management model? It's okay to be technically excellent and proceed because you're great, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be a good manager. And at that point, you have the responsibility to say, yeah, you can promote me for my technical excellence, but please don't add managerial or people management aspects to my role.
Yeah. Individual contributor roles.
Yeah.
Increasingly important.
So then are we doing anything about emotional intelligence? There's been there's loads of literature about it. We know that actually we need managers who are emotionally intelligent. Is that even measured? Is that even a thing in organizations? If it's not, should it be? So there's a question there. And if you want people who are empathetic and sympathetic, you would want somebody who's got strong emotional intelligence, who understands how people think and how people act. I suppose, is review the training that managers are given? So, we've got a lot of business schools now who do a lot of training in things like accounting and management and business and politics. But do they do training on well-being, people skills, people management? No. So we need to think about the technical training that managers are given. I would argue that coaching would be something that's really good, individual people coaching, but also we can throw as much training and coaching at a manager, but if they don't have the time, ability or motivation to do it, that's not gonna make an ounce of difference. So once again, it goes back to, are we choosing the right people to go to that role? Do we give them enough feedback? So as senior managers and as employees, if we don't think we're being managed well, are we giving them enough feedback to even give them the opportunity to improve? And then we need to think about the health and well-being of the line manager themselves. If somebody isn't mentally well or physically well to manage, that's going to have an impact on their ability to manage, but also the well-being of those whom they manage. Yeah. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not. And this is why organisations go for the head massages, the Pilates, the fruit baskets, right? Because that's an easy thing to do. I'm not saying these changes are easy, but this is where the evidence lies about about the positive change for organisations. And this is, if you want to see real change, then it is good evidence, good work, and good management. And hopefully happier organisations going forward.
With better results.
Yeah.
Zofia, thank you so much. That was a perfect way to wrap everything up. And yes, not easy, but definitely very important, particularly as we're moving through more turbulence, which is not going to stop anytime soon. So very much appreciate all the research and evidence and insights that you've been sharing with us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been excellent. I've loved it.
Thanks so much again to Dr. Zofia Bajorek, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Employment Studies. You can follow Zofia on LinkedIn and on X at Dr. Zofia, DrZofia, as well as go to the website for the Institute of Employment Studies at employment-studies.co.uk, or follow them on X at Employment Studies, EMPLOYMTSTUDIES. Please see the show notes for links to many relevant articles and research. Immediate action tip. Good work requires good managers. Ensure those being promoted to manager have people management skills as well as technical excellence. They need training and coaching support as well as feedback to help them continue to improve. For more information about human-centric work and how empathy helps you understand what your workforce needs, take a look at my book, Empathy Works, The Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You could also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, commentary, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.